I'm Elspeth Gable, I'm 82 years old, and I'm a woman who believed that the walls of a home were built not just with timber and nails, but with love and memory. That is, until my son and his family taught me that some people see walls only as containers for their own desires. My story is about how I was asked to give up the heart of my home, the master bedroom I had shared with my late husband for 50 years, for my spoiled 16-year-old granddaughter, and how in response I evicted all of them from the house I own, the house I pay for, the house that was supposed to be my sanctuary. This house, nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street, was Arthur's and my masterpiece. We bought the land in 1968 with money we had saved so carefully, scrimping on dates and driving a beat-up old Ford that shuddered every time it came to a stop. My Arthur, was a draftsman, and he designed this house himself. Every night for a year, he'd unroll blueprints across our tiny apartment's dining table, his brow furrowed in concentration, a pencil tucked behind his ear. He designed it with our future in mind. A room for the baby we hoped for, a large kitchen because he knew how much I loved to bake, and a master bedroom that faced east so we could wake up with the sun. We built it, sometimes literally with our own hands, hiring contractors we knew and hammering nails alongside them on the weekends. This house wasn't just property, it was a living testament to our life together. It absorbed the echoes of our laughter, the tears of our sorrows, and the quiet rhythm of our shared days. When our son, Robert, was born, his first cries bounced off these very walls. When Arthur passed away 5 years ago, the silence he left behind was deafening. The house felt cavernous, each empty room a reminder of my loss. But in that silence, I also found a strange comfort. His presence lingered in the worn armchair in the living room, in the scent of sawdust that never quite left the garage, and most of all in our bedroom. It was my sanctuary within a sanctuary. His pipe tobacco tin still sat on his nightstand. His favorite worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea was still on the bookshelf. Sleeping in that room was like being held in the arms of our shared history. I was lonely, yes, but I was not entirely alone. I had my memories and I had my peace. My son Robert is my only child. I love him, of course. A mother's love is a stubborn, resilient thing, but love does not always blind you to a person's flaws. Robert inherited his father's kind eyes, but none of his foresight or work ethic. He was a man who always seemed to be chasing a shortcut, a get-rich-quick scheme that never quite panned out. His wife, Cynthia, was a woman who seemed to be perpetually disappointed that Robert's shortcuts had not yet led to a mansion in the hills. She had expensive taste and a knack for making her desires sound like absolute necessities. Their daughter, my granddaughter Ashley, was the culmination of their shared philosophies. She was a pretty girl, I suppose, but her beauty was eclipsed by an aura of entitlement so potent it was almost tangible. She was their golden child, a princess whose every whim was a command. The pattern of favoritism and entitlement was not new. It had been a quiet undercurrent in our family for years. I remember Ashley's 10th birthday. They had thrown a lavish party at a fancy rental hall complete with a pony and a magician. A week later was my 70th. Robert and Cynthia took me out to a chain restaurant for dinner. Over the cheap breadsticks, Cynthia spent the entire meal scrolling through photos of Ashley's party on her phone, sighing about the cost. "It was worth it, though," she'd said, not looking at me. "Anything for our princess." I received a scented candle as a gift. It was a small thing, a petty thing to even remember, but it was a clear signal of my place in the family hierarchy, a supporting character, an afterthought. Another time, a few years back, my old car finally gave up the ghost. I had some savings set aside and I was planning to buy a modest, reliable sedan. Robert heard about it and came over, his face a mask of practiced concern. He said, "Mom, you know Ashley's been doing so well in school, we want to reward her. What if we pooled our money? We could get a much nicer, safer SUV. You could use it whenever you need, of course, but it would officially be for Ashley to use when she gets her license." Cynthia had chimed in, saying how much safer I would be in a big, sturdy car. The translation was clear. They wanted me to subsidize a luxury car for their 16-year-old. I politely declined, explaining I wanted something smaller that was my own. The frost from Cynthia was immediate. She didn't speak to me for a month. Robert just looked disappointed, as if I had failed some crucial test of generosity. The most telling incident perhaps happened just before they moved in. Arthur and I had a small vacation fund we'd contributed to for decades, dreaming of a cruise through the Alaskan glaciers. After he passed, I couldn't bring myself to go alone, and the money just sat there. Robert knew about it. He and Cynthia were planning a trip to Hawaii for their 25th anniversary. He approached me with a proposal. He wanted to borrow the entire fund. "It's just sitting there, Mom," he'd said, his voice smooth as honey. "Let us use it to make some memories. We'll pay you back a little bit each month." I knew, just as I knew the sun would rise, that I would never see a dime of it. I told him no. I told him that money was mine and Arthur's. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was a kind of baffled indignation, as if he simply couldn't comprehend why his needs weren't my absolute priority. Cynthia later called it hoarding memories and told a cousin I was becoming a bitter old woman. These were the people I was about to welcome into my home, but he was my son and he was in trouble. What else was a mother to do? I opened my door, and in doing so, I invited the serpent into my garden. The phone call came on a Tuesday. It was Robert, his voice strained. He'd lost his job. The tech startup he'd been working for, the one that was always on the verge of something big, had unceremoniously folded. He'd been laid off along with everyone else. He tried to sound optimistic, talking about severance and new opportunities, but I could hear the panic humming beneath the surface. Then came the real reason for the call. Their lease was up at the end of the month, and without his income, they couldn't possibly afford to renew, let alone find a new place. "Mom," he said, the word heavy with unspoken expectation, "we have nowhere to go. We were wondering, just for a little while, just until I get back on my feet, if maybe the three of us could stay with you." Part of me, the wise, cynical part that had been honed by 82 years of observation, screamed no. It knew what would happen. But another, larger part, the mother in me, took over. He was my son. He was hurting. How could I say no? This house had 4 bedrooms. It was far too big for one old woman. "Of course, Robert," I heard myself say. "You are always welcome here. This is your family home." The relief in his voice was so profound it almost washed away my own misgivings. Almost. They arrived 2 weeks later, not with a humble moving van but with a parade of boxes that seemed to fill my entire driveway. It was an invasion, not a retreat. Cynthia directed the process like a disgruntled general, pointing at my furniture and sighing as if its very existence was an inconvenience. "We'll have to find a place for all this stuff," she said, waving a dismissive hand at the grandfather clock that had been a wedding gift from my parents. Ashley, my granddaughter, didn't even bother to feign politeness. She walked through the front door with her headphones on, eyes glued to her phone, and immediately complained. "There's no signal in here," she announced to the world at large. She was given the guest room, a lovely room with a view of the back garden and its own bathroom. It was the room Robert had grown up in. I'd freshly painted it and bought new bedding. Her review: "The wallpaper is hideous. It smells like old people." In the beginning, I tried to embrace it. I told myself that the noise and chaos were signs of life, a welcome change from the oppressive quiet. I cooked large meals, pretending we were a happy, multi-generational family living in harmony, but the harmony was a fantasy. My home, my sanctuary, slowly but surely began to feel like occupied territory. It started with small things. My morning routine was sacred to me. I'd wake with the sun, go down to my kitchen, make a pot of tea, and sit at the table reading the newspaper. It was my quiet hour to connect with the world and with myself. Within a week, that was gone. Cynthia was an early riser too, but her morning ritual involved blasting a high-powered blender to make some sort of green concoction that smelled like lawn clippings and despair. The roar of the blender would shatter the morning peace, followed by her loud, one-sided phone calls to her friends, complaining about her situation. My living room, with its comfortable, well-worn furniture, was no longer mine. Robert would commandeer the television all evening, watching loud action movies that made the windows rattle. My armchair, Arthur's armchair, was perpetually draped with Ashley's school backpack or Cynthia's shopping bags. If I wanted to sit in it, I first had to excavate it. More than once, I found myself retreating to my bedroom by 7 o'clock just to find a little bit of peace. Then came the redecorating. It began as suggestions. "You know, Mom, some modern art would really liven this place up," Cynthia would say, eyeing the framed landscape paintings Arthur and I had collected. Then things started to move. A small table that had stood by the entryway for 40 years was suddenly in the upstairs hallway. A lamp I cherished was replaced by a sleek metallic thing that cast a cold, sterile light. When I asked about it, Cynthia would wave her hand and say, "Oh, just trying to freshen things up. It's so dated, don't you think?" She wasn't asking for my opinion. She was delivering a verdict. I was dated. My taste was dated. My life was dated. They treated me less like the owner of the house and more like a live-in housekeeper. Dishes were left in the sink, towels on the bathroom floor. Ashley's room was a disaster zone, and when I once meekly suggested she might tidy it, Cynthia swooped in to her defense. "She's under so much stress, Elspeth. The move, school, she doesn't need you nagging her." The financial strain was immediate. My utility bills tripled. The grocery bill was astronomical. Robert was supposed to be looking for a job, but most days I saw him on the couch, scrolling through his laptop, applying for jobs that were clearly outside his qualifications. Cynthia, meanwhile, did not curb her spending habits. Packages from online retailers arrived almost daily. When I saw a new, expensive-looking handbag on her arm, I felt a knot of resentment tighten in my stomach. I was paying for the electricity that charged her phone, the water for her long showers, the food she ate, all while she bought luxuries I would never dream of affording for myself. I felt myself shrinking within my own home. I started eating my meals earlier just to avoid the tension at the dinner table. I spent more and more time in the garden or visiting my friend and neighbor Maggie. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, haunting the hallways of a house that was no longer my own. The final sacred space I had was my bedroom. It was my fortress of solitude, and it was the last thing they could possibly take from me, or so I thought. The campaign for the master bedroom began subtly, a slow drip of poison into the family well. It started with Ashley. My granddaughter had decided that her perfectly lovely guest room was, in fact, a glorified prison cell. "My bathroom is so small," she'd complain at the dinner table, pushing food around her plate. "And the closet is a joke. I have like nowhere to put my stuff." Robert would nod sympathetically. "It's an old house, sweetie. They didn't build big closets back then." But Cynthia would stoke the flames. "It's true, Rob. A girl her age needs her space. All her friends have these huge, beautiful rooms. It's embarrassing for her." They were laying the groundwork, seeding the idea. I chose to ignore it, assuming it was just typical teenage grumbling. I was wrong. It was a calculated opening salvo. For weeks, Ashley's complaints became a daily chorus. The lighting was bad for doing her makeup. The Wi-Fi was weaker at that end of the hall. The window faced the wrong way. Every minor inconvenience was magnified into a catastrophic injustice. The direct assault came on a Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, humming to myself as I kneaded dough for a loaf of bread, one of the few activities that still brought me joy. Cynthia and Robert walked in together, their expressions a carefully orchestrated blend of solemnity and reason. It felt like a delegation approaching a foreign power. "Elspeth, can we talk to you for a minute?" Cynthia began, her voice smooth and practiced. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. Robert stood awkwardly by the door, unable to meet my eye. "Mom, it's about Ashley," he said. "What about Ashley?" I asked, my hands still covered in flour. "Is she all right?" "She's not happy, Elspeth," Cynthia said, taking over. "She's miserable here. She feels cooped up. It's affecting her schoolwork, her social life. She let the sentence hang in the air, laden with accusation. I looked from her to my son. She has a very nice room. It's the room you grew up in, Robert. You loved that room. That was different, Robert mumbled, looking at his shoes. I was a boy and times were different. Cynthia pounced on the opening. Exactly, times are different, and let's be honest, Elspeth, your room, the master suite, is enormous. It's the biggest room in the house. The bathroom is twice the size of hers, and that walk-in closet is just sitting there, mostly empty. I stopped kneading. A cold dread began to creep up my spine. I could see where this was going, but my mind refused to accept it. What are you suggesting, Cynthia? She finally said it. The words were wrapped in the language of logic and fairness, but they were utterly monstrous. We think it would be a fair and sensible solution for you to swap rooms with Ashley. Just temporarily, of course, until we're back on our feet. You're one person, you don't need all that space. But for a teenage girl, it would mean the world. It would give her the space she needs to thrive. I stared at her speechless, the air in the kitchen felt thick and heavy. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall. They wanted me to leave my room, the room where I had slept beside my husband for 5 decades, the room where I had woken up to the sunrise every morning since 1969, the room where I had held his hand as he took his last breath. They wanted me to pack up my memories, my grief, and my entire life and move into the guest room so their spoiled child could have a bigger closet. I wiped my floured hands on my apron, my movements slow and deliberate. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it felt as solid as granite. Cynthia's pleasant facade cracked. No, what do you mean no? Don't be unreasonable, Elspeth. It's the logical thing to do. There is nothing logical about it, I replied, my voice gaining strength. This is my room. It was my room with my husband. It is the one place in this house that is still mine. The answer is no. Robert finally spoke up, his voice wheedling. Mom, come on, don't be like this. It's for your granddaughter. Don't you want her to be happy? And that's when something inside me snapped. The quiet, accommodating Elspeth who baked bread and retreated to her room began to dissolve. Happy, I said, my voice rising. She has a roof over her head, a home she doesn't pay a penny for. She has food on the table that I buy. She has every comfort, and she is miserable because her closet isn't big enough. Do you hear yourselves? You come into my home, a home I opened to you out of love, and you have the audacity to ask me to give up my bedroom. The room my husband died in. Cynthia scoffed, a nasty, dismissive sound. Oh, don't be so dramatic. Arthur's been gone for 5 years. It's a room, it's not a shrine. It's about making a small, temporary sacrifice for the good of the family. I have made sacrifices, I was shouting now, the flour on my hands trembling. My peace is a sacrifice, my quiet is a sacrifice, my grocery bill is a sacrifice. I have given you this house and you are carving it up like it's yours for the taking. Well, it is not, and that room is mine. The discussion is over. I turned my back on them, a clear dismissal. I heard Cynthia hiss something to Robert. He tried one last time. Mom, just think about it. There is nothing to think about, Robert, I said without turning around. Get out of my kitchen. They left. I stood there for a long time, my hands braced on the counter, my heart hammering against my ribs. The bread dough sat on the board, forgot. The warmth in the kitchen had vanished, replaced by an icy chill. The battle line had been drawn, not over a room, but over my very existence, my right to be the matriarch in my own home. And I had a sickening feeling that the war had only just begun. The days that followed the confrontation were played out in a theater of suffocating silence. The previous chaos of their presence was replaced by something far more sinister, a coordinated campaign of psychological warfare. They were trying to make me feel like a stranger in my own home, a mad old woman clinging unreasonably to her possessions. The house became a landscape of passive aggression. Meals were no longer eaten together. Cynthia would prepare a separate dinner for her, Robert, and Ashley, leaving me to fend for myself, a clear delineation of the two camps now residing under one roof. They would speak to each other in hushed tones whenever I entered a room, their voices immediately ceasing, followed by sidelong glances that were heavy with judgment. They were isolating me, turning the familiar comfort of my home into a cold and alienating space. My son Robert was perhaps the most hurtful. He would try to engage me in mundane conversation, asking about the weather or if I needed anything from the store, but he would never ever mention the conflict. He was pretending it hadn't happened, and in doing so, he was invalidating my feelings entirely. His refusal to acknowledge the deep wound they had inflicted was a form of gaslighting in itself. He wanted me to believe that I was the one creating the tension, that my reaction had been the problem, not their demand. Cynthia was more direct. Her weapon of choice was a cloying, false concern. "Are you feeling all right, Elspeth?" she would ask, her voice dripping with insincerity. "You seem a bit confused lately." Or she would help me with tasks I had managed perfectly well for decades. "Oh, let me get that, you might drop it," she'd say, snatching a plate from my hands. She would move my keys, my reading glasses, my mail, and then feign surprise when I couldn't find them. "Are you sure you looked properly? You've been so forgetful these last few weeks." They were building a narrative brick by brick that I was losing my faculties, that I was no longer competent. It was a cruel, insidious strategy designed to make me doubt my own mind. And to my shame, it began to work. I started second-guessing myself. Had I overreacted? Was it just a room? Was I being the selfish, bitter old woman they accused me of being? The loneliness I'd felt after Arthur's death was nothing compared to this. This was a profound, soul-crushing isolation, the feeling of being erased while still being physically present. My bedroom became my only refuge. I would lock the door, something I had never done in 50 years, and sit in Arthur's armchair, just breathing. I felt besieged. I would look at the photos on our dresser, us on our wedding day, Robert as a baby, our family vacations, and I would weep. I wept for the husband I missed, for the son I felt I was losing, and for the happy memories that now felt tainted by the ugliness of the present. The breaking point, the moment the fog of my self-doubt was burned away by the harsh light of their true intentions, came on a Thursday evening. I had gone to bed early, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere any longer, but I couldn't sleep. I got up for a glass of water, my stockinged feet silent on the old wooden floors. As I approached the top of the stairs, I heard voices coming from the living room, Robert and Cynthia. I paused in the shadows of the hallway, my hand on the wall to steady myself. "She's not going to budge, Rob," Cynthia was saying, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "She's being completely irrational. It's like talking to a brick wall." I know," Robert's voice was weary, defeated. "But what can we do? It's her house." Then Cynthia said the words that froze the blood in my veins. "Is it though? I mean, is she really in a position to be managing it, or any of her affairs? She's 82, she's emotional, she's forgetful. Honestly, I think we need to start looking into our options. We should talk to a lawyer, maybe about getting power of attorney." My breath caught in my throat. Power of attorney. They wanted to take control, not just of the house but of everything, my finances, my decisions, my life. It wasn't about a bedroom for Ashley anymore. It had never been just about the bedroom. The bedroom was the key. If they could prove I was unreasonable about that, they could use it as leverage to argue I was incompetent about everything else. They wanted to strip me of my autonomy, render me a helpless dependent in my own home, all so they could live the life they felt they were owed, funded by my life's savings. "I don't know, Cynthia," Robert sounded hesitant. "That seems extreme." "What's extreme is living like this," she shot back. What's extreme is our daughter being miserable while your mother sits on a mountain of assets and a giant empty room out of pure stubbornness. Think about it, Robert, it would be for her own good. We could manage things for her, make sure she's taken care of, and we could finally make this house work for the whole family. I didn't need to hear any more. I backed away slowly, my heart a block of ice in my chest. I crept back into my room and locked the door, my hands shaking so violently I could barely turn the key. The tears that came now were not of sadness or loneliness. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They had mistaken my grief for senility. They had underestimated me. The gaslighting, the manipulation, the whispers, it all clicked into place. This was a coup. And I was not going to let them win. Sitting there in the dark in the sanctuary they so desperately coveted, I felt a new resolve harden within me. The shrinking, ghostly version of myself was gone. They had meant to break me, but instead they had forged me into something new, something much, much stronger. The next morning I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The rage from the night before had cooled into a calm, focused resolve. The self-doubt was gone, replaced by a steely certainty. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed an ally, not just for legal advice, but for moral support. I needed someone to confirm that I wasn't crazy, that my anger was justified. I needed my best friend. Margaret Chen Maggie had lived in the house across the street from me for 52 years. She and her husband, David, had moved in the year after Arthur and I finished building our place. Maggie was a force of nature. A retired history professor, she was sharp, witty, and possessed a finely tuned nonsense detector. We had raised our children together, celebrated countless milestones, and supported each other through the loss of our husbands. While I was quiet and sometimes overly trusting, Maggie was outspoken and fiercely protective. If I was the calm harbor, Maggie was the lighthouse, cutting through the fog with a beam of unwavering truth. I called her at 9 o'clock sharp. "Maggie," I said, my voice steady, "can I come over for a cup of tea? There's something I need to talk to you about." "Elspeth, of course," she said, her tone instantly alert. "You sound different. Is everything all right?" "No," I said simply, "but it's going to be. I'll be there in 5 minutes." I walked across the street, feeling the morning sun on my face. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was scurrying away from my own home. I was walking toward a solution. Maggie opened the door before I even knocked, her brow furrowed with concern. She ushered me into her bright, sunny kitchen that smelled of coffee and cinnamon. She sat me down at her small oak table, placed a steaming mug in my hands, and said, "All right, tell me everything, and don't leave out a single detail." And so I did. I told her everything. I told her about the constant demands, the slow takeover of my house, the disrespect from Ashley, the way Cynthia treated me like an inconvenience. I told her about the calculated demand for my bedroom, the argument in the kitchen, and the cold, silent war that followed. And then, my voice dropping low, I told her what I had overheard the night before, the hushed conversation about power of attorney. As I spoke, I watched Maggie's face transform. Her initial concern morphed into disbelief, then into a slow-burning fury. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her own mug. When I finished, she was silent for a full minute, her dark eyes flashing. Finally, she slammed her mug down on the table, making the spoons in the holder jump. The unmitigated gall, she spat, her voice vibrating with indignation. Power of attorney, those parasitic, blood-sucking. She let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. It was magnificent. They come into your home, live off your dime, and then plot to have you declared incompetent because you won't give their spoiled brat your bedroom. Oh, I don't think so. The relief that washed over me was so intense it almost brought me to tears. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being unreasonable. My anger was valid. Maggie's outrage was a mirror to my own, validating every feeling I had been forced to question. She reached across the table and took my hands. Her hands were warm and strong. "Elspeth, listen to me," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. You are one of the strongest, kindest women I have ever known. You and Arthur built that house with your own 2 hands and a whole lot of love. It is your castle. What they are doing is elder abuse, plain and simple. They are preying on your good nature." She leaned in closer. "Do you remember what Arthur said to me a few weeks before he passed? He was worried about you being alone. I promised him I would look out for you. And he said to me, 'Maggie, she seems gentle, but she's got a spine of steel. She just sometimes forgets where she put it. Elspeth, it's time to find your spine.'" Her words were like a splash of cold water. Arthur had said that. I had forgotten. In my grief and my desire to keep the peace, I had allowed myself to bend and bend until I was almost broken. "They think they've already won," Maggie continued. "They think you're a weak old woman they can roll over. You are about to prove them very, very wrong. You are not just going to say no, you are going to get them out of your house, all of them." "How, Maggie?" I asked, the practicalities of it feeling overwhelming. "He's my son." "He stopped acting like a son when he conspired with his viper of a wife to strip you of your rights," she said bluntly. "This isn't about him being your son anymore. This is about them being tenants, unwanted tenants. You need a lawyer, a good one, not just to find out your rights, but to make this official and ironclad so they can't try any more of their nonsense." She stood up and went to a drawer, pulling out a notepad and a pen. "My nephew, Michael, is a lawyer. He specializes in property law. He's smart, he's tough, and he has no patience for bullies. I'm going to call him right now and set up an appointment for you." Just like that, she had a plan. She was a whirlwind of decisive action. While I had been drowning in my own home, Maggie was throwing me a lifeline. She made the call, explaining the situation in crisp, no-nonsense terms. An appointment was made for the following afternoon. When I left Maggie's house an hour later, I felt like a different person. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. I walked back to my house not as a victim, but as a woman with a plan. I had a trusted friend in my corner and a lawyer's appointment in my calendar. I let myself in the front door, and when Cynthia gave me a suspicious look from the living room, I didn't scurry away. I met her gaze, held it for a moment, and gave her a small, tight smile. It was a smile that said, "The game has changed." She looked away first. The lawyer's office was in a tall, glass building downtown. It felt a world away from my quiet suburban street. Maggie's nephew, Michael Chen, was a young man with his aunt's sharp eyes and a calm, reassuring demeanor. I sat across from Hi's large mahogany desk, clutching my purse, and I told my story for the second time in 2 days. He listened patiently, taking notes, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Mrs. Gable," he began, his voice calm and professional, "first of all, what your son and his wife are doing is reprehensible. Maggie was right to call it a form of elder abuse. Their talk of power of attorney is a transparent and frankly disgusting attempt to seize your assets." He leaned forward. "Now let's talk about the solution. The good news is that the law is entirely on your side. This is your property. You have every right to determine who lives here. Since they are family and there is no lease agreement, they are considered tenants at will. This means you can terminate their tenancy at any time for any reason as long as you provide them with proper written notice." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "It means we will draft a formal eviction notice," he explained. "In this state, you are required to give them 30 days to vacate the premises. The notice will be legally binding. It will state clearly that their right to reside at the property will be terminated as of that date. If they refuse to leave, we can then file an unlawful detainer lawsuit and have the sheriff remove them. But hopefully it won't come to that." He looked at me directly. "This will not be pleasant, Mrs. Gable. It will likely cause a permanent rupture in your relationship with your son. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of Arthur. I thought of his words about my spine of steel. I thought of the whispers in the hallway and the plot to take away my life's independence. My relationship with my son ruptured the moment he decided his daughter's desire for a bigger closet was more important than his mother's dignity. I said, my voice firm. Yes, Mr. Chen, I am prepared. Please draft the notice. I walked out of that office feeling 10 feet tall. Michael had given me the weapon I needed and I was ready to use it. I went home and waited. The official documents arrived by courier 2 days later in a crisp manila envelope. They were formal, printed on legal letterhead and utterly uncompromising. The finality of it was terrifying but also exhilarating. I chose to serve the notice on a Saturday morning. I wanted them all to be there. I came downstairs to find them in the kitchen. Robert was reading the sports section, Cynthia was on her laptop at the table, and Ashley was staring blankly into the refrigerator. The air was thick with the usual resentment. I walked over to the table and placed the envelope squarely in the center. Robert, Cynthia, I said, my voice was calm, almost unnaturally so, this is for you. Cynthia looked up, annoyed. What is it? She asked, not touching it. It's a legal notice, I said. I suggest you read it. Robert, his curiosity piqued, picked up the envelope. He tore it open and pulled out the papers. I watched his face as he read. The color drained from it, his eyes widened in disbelief, and then he looked up at me, his mouth slightly agape. Mom, what is this? He whispered, his voice trembling. Eviction, 30 days, is this a joke? Cynthia snatched the papers from his hand. Her eyes flew across the page and her face, unlike Robert's, did not register shock. It registered pure, undiluted fury. She shot to her feet, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You old witch, she shrieked, her voice high and shrill. How dare you, after everything we've done, coming here to keep you company in this dusty old mausoleum? This is how you repay us. Keep me company? I replied, my calm unwavering. It was a strange, out-of-body experience. Their rage couldn't touch me. You came here because you were homeless. I gave you shelter. In return, you treated me like a servant, you tried to take my bedroom, and you plotted to have me declared incompetent. I think 30 days' notice is more than generous. Ashley, finally paying attention, looked from her mother's furious face to her father's stunned one. She's kicking us out, she asked, her voice filled with a kind of whiny incredulity. Where are we supposed to go? That is no longer my concern, I stated. Robert finally found his voice. It was pleading, pathetic. Mom, please, you can't do this. We'll be on the street. I'm your son, she's your granddaughter. You should have remembered that, Robert, I said, my gaze fixed on him. You should have remembered you were my son when you stood by and let your wife demand the one thing I had left of your father. You should have remembered she was my granddaughter when you taught her that she was entitled to everything, including my dignity. The dam of Cynthia's rage broke completely. The accusations came thick and fast. I was selfish. I was cruel. I was a monster. I was throwing my own flesh and blood out for a room. Ashley started to CR. Why loud, theatrical sobs designed for maximum effect? Robert just kept stammering, I can't believe this, I can't believe this. I let them rage, I let the storm break over me. I stood there, silent and unflinching, until their fury began to exhaust itself. When Cynthia finally paused for breath, her chest heaving, I spoke one last time. The notice is legal and binding, I said, my voice cutting through the drama. You have 30 days. I suggest you spend less time yelling at me and more time looking for a new place to live. I then turned, walked out of the kitchen, went into my bedroom, and locked the door. I could still hear them shouting, the sound muffled through the thick wood. But for the first time, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like the desperate, fading roar of a defeated enemy. The war was over. I had won. The final 30 days were the longest month of my life. The house was no longer a Cold War zone, it was an active battlefield, thick with a toxic, simmering hatred. Cynthia refused to speak to me, communicating only through slammed doors and muttered insults just loud enough for me to hear. Ashley treated me with open contempt, glaring at me as if I were a bug she wanted to squash. The most painful part was Robert. He tried to appeal to me several times, his arguments swinging wildly between guilt, pleading, and anger. He would talk about his childhood in this house, about his father, about his duty as a son. He was trying to wield my love for him as a weapon to make me feel so guilty that I would relent. "How can you do this to your family, Mom?" he asked one evening, catching me in the hallway. "Dad would be so ashamed of you." That was a low blow, and it hurt. But my resolve, forged in the fire of their betrayal and solidified by Maggie's support, did not waver. "Your father would be ashamed of you, Robert," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. "He would be ashamed that you stood by while your wife tried to bully your own mother. He built this house to be my sanctuary, not your flophouse." He had no answer to that. They made a show of their predicament, making loud, dramatic phone calls to relatives, painting me as a cruel, senile old woman who had thrown them out on a whim. I'm sure some of them believed it, but I didn't care anymore. My world had shrunk to this house and the moral line I had drawn within it. They procrastinated their packing until the final week, a last-ditch effort, I suppose, to see if I would change my mind. When it became clear I would not, a frantic, resentful energy filled the house. Boxes appeared, furniture was scraped across floors, and the sounds of their arguments echoed through the halls. They found a small, overpriced apartment across town, and the complaints about its size and inadequacy were constant and loud. The day of the move was gray and overcast, matching the mood inside. I stayed in my room, the door closed. I could hear the movers, the heavy thud of furniture on the stairs, the terse, angry commands from Cynthia. Around 3 in the afternoon, there was a knock on my bedroom door. It was Robert. "We're leaving now," he said through the door, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. I opened it. He stood there, looking tired and older than his 54 years. For a fleeting moment, I saw the little boy I had raised, and my heart ached. But then I saw the weakness in his eyes, the resentment, and the ache subsided. I can't understand you," he said, shaking his head. "Tearing the family apart like this, for what? For a room." "It was never about the room, Robert," I said softly. "And you know that. This was about respect. The respect you failed to show me and the self-respect I decided I deserved. I hope you find what you're looking for." He just stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. I heard the front door open, then slam shut, and then silence. It was a silence unlike any I had ever experienced in this house. It wasn't the lonely silence of grief I had felt after Arthur died. It wasn't the oppressive, hostile silence of the last few months. This was a clean, pure, and profound silence. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of my home breathing again. I waited a full hour before I left my room. I walked slowly through the house. It was a mess. There were scuff marks on the walls, dust bunnies in the corners, and a faint, lingering scent of Cynthia's cloying perfume. But it was my mess. It was my house. I walked through the living room and instinctively went to Arthur's armchair. It was empty, not covered in bags or backpacks, just empty, waiting. I ran my hand over the worn fabric. I went into the kitchen. The counter was clear. My breadboard was where it was supposed to be. Finally, I walked back upstairs to my bedroom. I opened the door and stood on the threshold. The afternoon light was streaming through the east-facing window, illuminating dust motes dank. Being in the air, the room felt vast, it felt calm, it felt mine. I walked over to the bed and sat on the edge on my side. I reached over and placed my hand on Arthur's side on the cool fabric of the bedspread. The house was quiet, my heart was quiet, the war was over. The cost had been high, my relationship with my son and his family was in ruins, perhaps forever. But as I sat there in my sanctuary, reclaimed and whole, I knew I had made the right choice. I had lost a part of my family, but I had found myself again. And in the profound, welcoming silence of my home, that felt like a victory. They say that blood is thicker than water. It's a phrase people use to demand loyalty, to guilt you into forgiveness, to insist that family comes first no matter the cost. But I have learned that love is not an obligation and respect is not an entitlement. It must be earned and it must be protected. My story isn't about revenge. It isn't about punishing my son or his family. It is about the painful, necessary lesson of setting boundaries. I learned that allowing people, even the people you love most, to disrespect you is not a form of kindness. It is a form of self-destruction. You teach people how to treat you, and by demanding my home and my dignity back, I was finally teaching a lesson I should have taught long ago. I had to become the villain in their story to remain the hero of my own. My house is quiet now. It is filled not with the ghosts of anger and entitlement, but with the gentle echoes of a life well lived and the promise of a future lived on my own terms. Peace, I've discovered, is a far more valuable inheritance than a fractured family.